Have you ever felt like you're in a relationship where the more you try to explain yourself, the more misunderstood you become? The more you try to make things clear, the deeper you get lost in a maze with no exit? You might not realize it, but that's when you've quietly stepped into a game someone else has created, without you even noticing. And then you start asking yourself, why am I so tired, confused, and even disoriented, even though they don't yell, don't insult me, don't get angry? They don't need to raise their voice because just one glance, one loaded question, one half-hearted compliment can keep you awake all night. That's not love. That's manipulation. But here's the thing. What truly crushes a manipulator or narcissist isn't your arguments or your efforts to expose them. It's when you quietly walk away from their game. No anger, no grand exit. You simply stop reacting. And that silence, that's what stings them the most. Because the truth is, you don't need to defeat anyone to reclaim your power. You just need to stop giving your energy to those who don't deserve it. And when you do, not only are you free, but they can no longer control you. So, how does a deeply sensitive soul rise above a narcissist? Not through revenge, but through inner healing. Let's go deeper, one step at a time back to your center. Part 1. Healing starts when you stop blaming yourself. Have you ever felt like you loved too much, gave too much, endured too long, until you forgot who you were? I once met a woman in her 60s during a morning meditation session. She sat quietly for a long time before softly saying, "I don't blame anyone, teacher. I'm just sad. Because I was always the one holding everything together. And yet, I was the one left behind." I stayed silent for a moment and gently asked her, "Have you ever forgiven yourself?" She looked at me, surprised, and then her eyes filled with tears. Because here's what most people don't see. Deep inside those who always try to keep the peace, who constantly put others first, there's a quiet wound, self-blame, blaming themselves for not doing enough, for trusting the wrong person, for forgiving too much, for hoping for too long. But from a Buddhist perspective, self-blame doesn't help us grow. It only drains our life energy. And when a deeply sensitive Sula, kind, sincere, compassionate person finally sees this clearly, that's when healing begins. Picture this: a cup that's already empty, still trying to pour more, until there's nothing left but exhaustion. Compassion doesn't mean draining yourself dry. It doesn't mean absorbing someone else's toxicity and calling it kindness. The Buddha never taught us to sacrifice ourselves for someone else's harm. He taught the middle way balance. And there can be no balance when you've lost yourself. When you stop, when you lay down the burden, when you forgive yourself for what's already past, your life energy returns. I often tell my older students, the spiritual path isn't a path of suffering. It's a path of awakening. And the first awakening is this: you deserve peace. So if you're quietly carrying guilt or regret, try saying this gently to yourself. I did the best I could with what I had. And now I allow myself to rest, to heal, to live. And that's how the journey back begins. Not with logic, but with loving kindness toward yourself. Part 2. When reacting becomes the trap. Have you ever noticed there are people who don't yell, don't insult, don't give commands, but somehow just one comment, a sigh at the right moment, or a certain look from them is enough to make you feel uneasy, confused, and desperate to explain yourself? There's no shouting, but your heart feels shaken. There's no violence, but your peace is gone. I've spoken with many Buddhist students, especially those in their 40s, 50s, 60s who've shared this same feeling. They're in relationships that seem fine on the outside. No screaming, no hitting, no obvious disrespect. But inside, they feel drained, controlled, and full of self-doubt. And I often tell them, not everyone who hurts you uses fists. Some only need to use your own emotions. In Buddhism, we speak of the narcissist as someone deeply driven by craving your energy, your attention. And the truth is, they don't need force to control you. They only need one thing, your reaction. The moment you get angry, the moment you rush to explain yourself, the moment you feel the need to defend, you open the door, and they walk right in. Imagine this. Someone is standing outside the door to your inner peace. They don't break it down. They just knock softly. But the moment you open it, you're giving them permission. And if they're skilled manipulators, they won't leave quickly. They'll rearrange the furniture of your mind, make you question your own feelings, until you no longer recognize yourself. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha teaches, one who masters the mind avoids countless sorrows. Reaction is where manipulation takes root. They don't need to harm you if they can get you to give up your peace on your own. And older people often have a strength, life experience. But with that experience sometimes comes the habit of always trying to make peace, to explain, to hold relationships together, even when it means reacting more than they realize. I once met an older woman. Every time her son got angry, she would rush to ask, "Did I do something wrong?" And each time, his response was silence, or a look that left her sleepless all night. I gently told her, "It's not your son who's controlling you. It's your reaction that's giving him that power." When you stop reacting, you begin waking up. And when you wake up, the manipulator can no longer enter. So, if you find yourself stuck in a cycle of endless reaction, step back, breathe slower, observe instead of respond. Choose awareness over the emotional wave. Because, as the Buddha said, the wise remain steady like a rock in the current. And that's where peace begins. Part 3. The stillness of awakening. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from pain, but from awakening. And that kind of silence is what truly unsettles a controlling person the most. I once sat with an elderly man in his 70s. He had spent over 40 years in a relationship full of conflict. He told me quietly, "I no longer yell, I don't argue. I just stay silent. Not because I'm sad anymore, but because I've realized there's nothing more I need to prove." He smiled as he said that, not a bitter smile, but the smile of someone who had stepped out of suffering. You see, sometimes we're silent because we're hurting, but other times we're silent because we finally understood. We understand that if someone truly values us, they'll listen even when we say nothing. We understand that a relationship that demands us to constantly react, explain, or beg to be understood is no longer love. It's dependence. In Buddhism, silence is never weakness. Silence is a form of wisdom. When the Buddha was insulted, he didn't argue. He simply smiled and said, "If someone offers me a gift, and I do not accept it, then the gift remains with the giver." I often tell older students, silence after clarity means you no longer need anything from them. Not an apology, not recognition, not closure. Just peace won that no longer depends on anyone else. Because their power over you, it was never real. It only existed as long as you kept reacting. Imagine this. There's a door that someone used to knock on every day. They got used to you opening it, to you being shaken, explaining yourself. But now, the door remains closed, and no one's standing behind it anymore. And the one who used to hold power over your emotions now feels emptiness. You didn't vanish. You just quietly stepped out of their game. So if you're in a season of life where silence is your path, ask yourself, am I quiet because I'm hurt or because I finally understand? And if it's the second, then you're not growing weaker. You're growing wiser. True peace doesn't come from winning the argument, but from realizing you no longer need to argue at all. Because now, you've come home to yourself, to your breath, to a stillness that no one else controls. And in that moment, you've stepped out of their grip, not with shouting, but with the quiet, unwavering presence of awakened silence. Part 4. Withdrawing with wisdom. There's a kind of person who doesn't need to win an argument. They don't need to say the final word. They just need one thing: peace. I remember once, during a meditation retreat at the monastery, an older gentleman, probably in his mid-60s, spoke to me after the Dharma talk. He said, "Teacher, when I was younger, I used to think I had to explain myself. I had to prove I was right, but over time, it just became exhausting. And then one day, I stopped. Not because I lost, but because I no longer needed to win." I smiled, because I knew that's the sign of someone who's growing not in pride, but in wisdom. Have you ever felt that way? When you realize not every battle is worth fighting, and not everyone is truly listening even if you explain yourself 100 times, perfectly and clearly. For deeply sensitive souls, those who feel deeply, care deeply, the most painful thing isn't being misunderstood. It's trying to explain yourself to someone who doesn't want to understand. And one day, they let go. Not because they're weak, not because they're afraid, but because they've seen clearly, so clearly, that no more effort is needed. The Buddha taught that true wisdom comes from reflection. And when you truly see the nature of something, you don't have to resist it. You simply step back at the right time. Stepping back isn't giving up. It's knowing your limits. It's recognizing where your heart no longer belongs, where your energy is no longer meant to be planted. There's a story in the middle-length discourses where the Buddha quietly walked away from a heated debate. Not because he couldn't argue, but because he saw the other person didn't seek truth, only victory. He didn't argue. He didn't defend. He simply smiled and left. Because truth doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to be lived. So if you, listening now, find yourself in a relationship where you constantly feel the need to explain, to prove, to be understood, give yourself permission to step back, not in anger, but in wisdom. You don't need to raise your voice to prove your worth. You don't need to fix what never wanted healing. You just need to come home to your breath, to your stillness, and to the deep knowing that your peace is never in someone else's hands. That's the quiet power of an awakened empath. No longer chasing victory. No longer needing to explain. Just clear enough to walk away. Gently, but firmly. Part 5. When your emotions are drained, there are some people, you never really see them happy. You never see them building anything good or kind. But strangely, they always show up when someone is hurting. They're always around when someone feels vulnerable. And somehow, they leave others even more confused, even more off balance. I remember speaking to a woman in her 60s. She told me she had been in a very strange relationship. No abuse, no harsh words, But every time they met, she left feeling completely drained. She said, "Teacher, I don't know why, but the more exhausted I felt, the more energized they seemed. The more confused I got, the calmer they became." I gently told her, "That's because they're feeding off your emotional energy. Have you ever met someone like that? They don't live from inner strength or practice or growth. They survive by feeding on the emotions of others, as if your pain is their nourishment." In Buddhism, we have a very important concept called self-reliance. The Buddha taught, "Be an island unto yourself. Be your own refuge." But narcissistic people aren't like that. They don't build, they consume. Not material things, but your attention, your confusion, your reactions, your unease. And the sad truth is, the ones they drain are often the kindest souls. Those who are compassionate, those who always listen, those who put others before themselves. They keep thinking, maybe if I just try harder, maybe if I'm more understanding, things will get better. But with narcissists, your efforts don't heal them. They only make them more dependent on your instability. I often remind older Buddhists, loving someone doesn't mean letting them drain your life force. Compassion doesn't mean becoming someone else's emotional supply. A person who truly loves you makes you feel peaceful when close and free when apart. But if someone constantly makes you feel guilty, like you must fix everything, apologize, overthink, maybe that's not love. Maybe you're being drained. And when you wake up to that truth, you start stepping out of the manipulation. Not through anger, but simply by no longer letting them touch your emotions. That is the strongest protection of all protecting your mind. Because as the Buddha once said, the mind is the forerunner of all things. The mind is the creator. The mind is the master. Guarding your mind is how you guard your true self. In a world where many people live off borrowed emotions from others. Part 6. The real battle is within. Many people have asked me, "Teacher, how do I escape a toxic relationship? How do I stop being manipulated? Stop feeling like I have to fight every single day just to keep myself at peace?" I usually pause for a moment before saying, the real battle isn't with the other person. It's whether or not you can hold your ground inside your own heart. In this life, conflict is everywhere. Situations that make us want to shout, defend, demand answers. But for those who feel deeply, who are empathic and gentle, there comes a quiet realization. Real change never starts outside. It begins within. I once met a man in his 70s. He told me that for most of his life he had tried to change everyone, his wife, his children, his coworkers, even his friends. But when his health began to fade, he stopped. And for the first time, he looked inward. He learned to breathe more deeply. Each morning, he'd walk slowly around his backyard. No phone, no radio, just silence. And he told me, nothing around me changed, but somehow I'm no longer shaken like I used to be. That's what happens when someone starts rebuilding their life from the inside out. A mindful breath, a slow morning, a calm no without needing to explain. Those tiny shifts create a powerful foundation. In Buddhism, we call that inner cultivation. We don't meditate to change others. We do it to make our minds clearer, lighter, more resilient. The Buddha never told us to go out and fix the world. He taught us to return inward, to hold our minds like still water so, even when storms come, the surface ripples gently and returns to peace. Imagine this. Two people live in the same noisy house. One rushes out, slams the windows, yells into the chaos, "Be quiet." The other sits down, puts on soft music, breathes slowly. Who truly wins in that moment? The empath doesn't win by shouting. They win through stillness, by creating an inner space that no one can invade. So if you're exhausted by a relationship that steals your sleep, or haunted by a memory that keeps playing in your mind, pause. Not to give up, but to turn inward. Because the real battleground isn't out there. It's here within your own mind. And that's also where you'll rediscover a kind of strength no one can ever take away. Your peace. Part 7. True power is inner mastery. You know, there's a kind of strength I deeply admire. Not the kind that argues loudly. Not the kind that wins every debate. Not even the kind that walks away from a relationship with their head held high. It's a quieter strength. The strength of someone who doesn't need to confront, to reclaim themselves. I remember a man in his 60s once told me at a Dharma talk, "Teacher, I don't want to argue anymore. I don't need to prove who's right or wrong. I just want peace. To wake up in the morning without this weight on my chest. To sleep at night without waking up in the dark, anxious." I nodded and replied, "In that moment, you're touching one of the deepest powers of a inner mastery." You see, in Buddhism, there's no belief that strength means winning. The Buddha taught, to conquer thousands in battle is nothing compared to conquering yourself. Winning the outside world may bring short-lived pride, but mastering your inner world brings lasting peace. And that kind of mastery doesn't come from loud declarations or dramatic exits. It comes from small, steady, quiet shifts inside you. It comes from learning to say no without feeling guilty. From choosing a morning walk over scrolling through chaos. From turning off the lights a little earlier, not to escape, but to breathe in the stillness of your own presence. Each time you do that, each time you hold a boundary without needing to defend it, you reclaim a part of yourself that was once lost. I've seen it again and again, especially in older practitioners. Once they reach their 50s or 60s, they stop chasing approval. They start turning inward, slowing down, rebuilding life from the inside. Not for show, but for truth. And one day they wake up to this truth. I don't need anyone to change for me to be at peace. I just need to tend to my own mind like guarding a small flame in the wind. Not letting it go out, not letting it flare and burn. Just steady, quiet, alive. Real power is never loud. It's in how you refuse to let someone else control your emotions. It's in how you live by your own value 7, if no one notices or praises you. It's in not needing to win, because you're already whole inside. So if you're on that journey today, quiet, slow, gentle, know this: you're on the right path. And each step you take inward is a step into freedom. Part 8. Silent withdrawal is how you end the game. Have you ever heard this saying? Someone can only manipulate you if you're still playing the game. I once met an elderly Buddhist woman, almost 70 years old. She told me that her whole life felt like a never-ending play. There were lead roles, side characters. Sometimes she was the victim. Sometimes she was cast as the villain. But one day, she stopped. Not with a fight, not with dramatic accusations. She just quietly stepped away. No noise, no more explanations, no more trying to please, no more hoping for a happy ending like in the movies. She simply walked off the stage calm, firm, and silent. And in that moment, the entire performance ended. Because without a stage, without an audience, the lead actor, the manipulator, the one who controlled with glances, silence, or guilt, suddenly didn't know what to do. No one left to blame. No one to test. No one to pull into their emotional whirlwind. In Buddhism, we call this stepping off the wheel of samsara, not by smashing it, but by waking up. When you stop clinging, stop reacting, stop trying to win, the cycle stops on its own. I still remember the Buddha's words. Freedom is not chasing or resisting. It is simply letting go. And that freedom doesn't need an announcement. It doesn't require approval. It only asks that you quietly step away from what no longer aligns with your peace. Withdrawal is not weakness. It's wisdom, because as long as you stay, they still have power over you. As long as you try to fix it, to make them see, to keep the peace, you're still fueling the game. But when you withdraw from a place of clarity and love for yourself, there's nothing left for them to hold on to. Picture this. A brightly lit stage, but the audience seats are empty. The actor is still there, still delivering lines, still angry, still dramatic, but their voice echoes into emptiness. No one's watching. No one's reacting. No one's playing along. And just like that, the play is over. No curtain needed. So if today you're wondering, how do I end a toxic relationship without fighting, without needing to win? The answer is, withdraw silently with wisdom, awareness, and compassion for yourself. Because once you're no longer in the game ends on its own. Part 9. What they fear most isn't hate, it's being forgotten. You know, some people don't actually need your love. They just need one thing. Your reaction. Just your anger. Just your reply. Just your pain. As long as you react, they feel alive in your mind. I once spoke with a Buddhist man in his 60s. He shared that after years in a controlling relationship, he no longer felt love, nor anger, just emptiness. And what brought him peace wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an apology from the other person. It was something else. He said, "Teacher, I used to think about them every single day. I was angry, sad, even hopeful at times. But now, some weeks go by, and I don't think of them at all. And I realized I'm finally getting free." I smiled because he didn't realize it yet. But that silence inside him, that absence, is what truly makes a narcissist crumble. The Buddha once said, "The mind leads all things. Whatever still lives in your mind still holds power." But once you stop reacting, stop thinking of them, their influence fades. You see, a manipulator doesn't need your genuine love. They just need to know they can still shake you. Whether you love or hate them, it doesn't matter. As long as you feel something, you're still in the emotional game. So what do they fear most? Not your hatred, but your forgetfulness. Imagine this. Someone used to standing center stage, soaking up every cheer, every criticism. But one day, they walk out, and no one even looks up. No one reacts. No one cares what they say or where they go. That silence for a narcissist is more painful than any insult. I often tell older Buddhists this. If you want to truly break free from an emotional trap, start by stepping out of your own mind. Stop thinking of them every morning. Stop wondering how they'll respond. Stop carrying them in your breath, your meals, your sleepless nights. Because the less they exist in your mind, the more you return to yourself. And eventually, you don't need to hate. You don't even need to forgive out of obligation. You just forget. And that is the greatest collapse for someone who once controlled you through emotion. Forgetting isn't carelessness, it's liberation. And sometimes, true forgiveness is when they no longer live in your mind. You're not clinging, not pushing, not explaining, not resenting. You're just living fully with yourself. And that's how you take your freedom back completely. Part 10. You don't need to win. Just stop getting pulled in. Some people, after years of living in chaotic relationships, slowly come to a realization that peace doesn't come from winning an argument or proving who's right. Peace comes when you're no longer pulled into the drama. Most people think strength means reacting, clapping back, teaching someone a lesson. But real strength, the deepest kind, is found in not being shaken. When someone says something hurtful or does something unfair, and yet you remain steady, inside that's power. During a meditation retreat in the Western U.S., a woman in her 70s said something that really touched me. "I don't want to win anymore. I just want peace." Such a simple sentence, but it held the weight of a lifetime. For highly sensitive people, those with deep, thoughtful hearts, what they long for isn't to win. It's to break free from the emotional whirlpools that make them lose themselves. In Buddhism, we call this letting go, not from hatred, but from wisdom. No clinging, no resentment. You're not walking away because you're weak, but because you finally see the truth. Chaos only continues when you participate. There's a verse from the Dhammapada. One who is not controlled by hatred, even when hated, is truly noble. Being noble isn't about standing above others. It's about standing firm while others are being swept away by emotions. When someone walks away from a fight, it's not because they lost. It's because they've realized their peace is worth more than any victory. Picture this. You're in a fast-spinning circle. The harder you try to balance, the dizzier you get. But once you step out, the circle still spins, but you're no longer dizzy. You're no longer reacting, no longer trying to explain or understand or fix. You're just no longer in it. And in that quiet step out, you reclaim your life. You don't need to win over anyone. You just need to stop letting others control how you feel. Because real freedom doesn't come from being right. It comes from choosing stillness, even while the world around you is loud. And when a sensitive soul reaches that point, they may not win, but they are finally free. Part 11. Not everyone deserves your kindness. Here's a truth many people only discover later in life. Not everyone deserves your kindness or your depth. It sounds simple, but for a lot of people, it takes years and a lot of pain to fully understand. At a recent sharing session, a woman in her 60s cried as she said, "I gave people everything. My time, my energy, my heart. I never held back. But in the end, I was the one they looked down on." She lowered her head, like she was questioning if she had done something wrong. But no, the mistake wasn't her kindness. It was offering that kindness to someone who didn't know how to value it. In Buddhism, this is called emotional ignorance. The belief that loving someone is enough, that giving will always be appreciated. But the truth is, love isn't always met with gratitude. Some people don't recognize the gift of a listening heart. They treat your kindness as something they're entitled to. And the more you give, the more they expect. For sensitive souls, the deep, genuine ones, the pain doesn't come from rejection. It comes from always feeling like they have to prove they deserve respect. Have you ever felt that? Having to explain why you're hurt. Swallowing your feelings just to keep the peace. Twisting yourself to avoid being misunderstood. And eventually, you forget that love doesn't have to be proven. One of the greatest awakenings is realizing you don't need to bend yourself to show you're a good person. And you definitely don't need to shrink yourself to keep an unhealthy relationship going. The Buddha taught, being close to the wise is like living among flowers. Being close to the foolish is like living among thorns. Love is the same way. It has to be placed in the right hands, where there is gratitude, mutual care, and mutual respect. You deserve relationships like that. Connections where you don't have to perform to be understood, where you don't have to squeeze yourself to fit into someone else's selfishness. You deserve to be loved simply for who you are. And if today you're learning to walk away from something unhealthy, know that it's not a failure. It's the first step back to what your heart truly deserves. Part 12. Peace doesn't need an explanation. There are moments in life when we choose silence. Not because we don't know what to say, not because we're weak, but because we've come to understand true peace doesn't need to be explained. I once sat down with an elderly Buddhist practitioner in the garden of a small temple in Northern California. She used to be a teacher, a family caretaker, the peacemaker every time conflict broke out. But that day, she sighed deeply and said, "These days, I don't feel like arguing anymore. Not because I'm wrong, just because it's not necessary." That sentence carried a quiet kind of beauty, the beauty of someone who's walked through storms and now chooses stillness. Have you ever felt like that? There was a time when we needed to be understood, when we wanted to clear things up, to be heard, to be seen. But one day, you realize you don't need to be understood anymore. Because if someone doesn't want to understand, no amount of explaining will change that. And if someone truly loves you, they can feel you, even in your silence. In Buddhist teachings, there's a word I love, upeksha. It means equanimity, letting go, not with bitterness, but with calm clarity. It's not about giving up. It's about releasing the need to control outcomes. It's about no longer letting the outside world dictate your inner world. Picture this. A storm rolls in. One person runs into the rain, shouting at the sky for getting them wet. Another quietly closes the door, lights a candle, and sits in a warm room. Which one is truly stronger? Real strength doesn't come from how loud your voice is, but from the steadiness of your heart in the middle of chaos. Many people, especially after middle age, begin to understand this lesson. Not everything needs a reaction. Not everyone deserves your explanation. And silence doesn't mean you lost. In fact, silence, once you've seen the truth, is a profound kind of wisdom. It means you're no longer pulled around by anger, hurt, or the need to be validated. It means you've chosen to hold on to your peace, like someone who knows the true worth of their calm heart. And that kind of peace doesn't need to be explained. It doesn't need agreement. It doesn't need proof. It just needs you to stop living in the version of yourself others expect. And that is a kind of power no one can take away. Part 13. Every time you don't react, you take your power back. Here's something few people talk about, but anyone who's ever been in a controlling relationship will understand. The other person doesn't need to be right. They don't need to be wise. They just need you to react. A frown, a question. Why did you do that? A long text explaining your feelings. All of it might seem like healthy communication, but it's actually how you unknowingly feed the energy of the manipulator. I once listened to a man in his 60s share his story after years in a tense family situation. He said, "I don't argue anymore, but I still feel unsettled inside because I keep thinking about how to make the other person understand or change." I nodded and gently said, "You may not be reacting with your voice, but your heart still is." In Buddhism, this is what we call attachment through the mind. You might not act on the outside, but inside, your thoughts are spinning. And as long as you're reacting even silently, you haven't truly reclaimed your power. On the other hand, every time you don't react is a moment you pull your energy back from their grip. Not out of avoidance, but from self-mastery. Not because you don't know what to say, but because you've chosen not to live there anymore. Imagine this. Someone keeps throwing pebbles into a lake, trying to make waves. But the lake is no longer there, only a quiet forest remains. No splash, no echo, no one waiting on the other side to say, "I understand you." And what happens next? The person becomes confused, then frustrated, and slowly, they lose their power. Because their power never came from themselves. It came from your reaction. So every time you stay silent, not to hide, but to rise, you're stepping away from a game that no longer suits your spirit. It's not, "I'll show you how strong I am." It's, "I'm not there anymore." And this is the truth. That deeply sensitive, kind-hearted people must remember, presence isn't always about reacting. Sometimes, the strongest presence is no response at all. That's the beginning of freedom. That's when you say to yourself, "I no longer belong to places that disturb my peace. I'm choosing stillness." And that is the deepest power you hold. No one can take it, because you no longer give it away. Part 14. The truth doesn't need to be argued. It just needs to be lived. For a long time in life, we're taught that if we want to prove we're right, we have to explain ourselves. We have to clarify everything, break it down, make others understand. But eventually, after enough heartbreak and exhaustion, highly sensitive people, those who feel deeply love, sincerely realize something powerful. The truth doesn't need to be argued. It just needs to be lived. I remember a quiet weekend afternoon at a meditation retreat for older adults. A woman in her mid-60s looked at me and said sadly, "I've spent years trying to prove I wasn't wrong. I wrote letters. I had long talks. I even brought in people to testify. But still, they won't understand." I looked at her and gently replied, "That's because they don't want to understand. And if someone doesn't want to, no amount of explaining will reach them." That's not a failure. That's awakening. Because one of the deepest forms of suffering for sincere people is trying to live honestly with someone who refuses to see the truth. In Buddhist teachings, there's a beautiful example. When people challenged or attacked the Buddha, he never argued back. He didn't debate. He simply smiled and kept living as he lived. Because he knew, truth isn't in what you say. It's in how you live every step, every breath, every choice. Have you ever felt drained from constantly explaining yourself? Searching for words others could have felt with their hearts? Answering questions that were never asked to understand, only to challenge? If so, you might be standing at a threshold where the deeply sensitive begin returning to their own inner truth. No more proving, no more justifying, just quietly living your values. The truth doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to be accepted. It doesn't need applause. It only needs you to have the courage to live it calmly and consistently. In your actions, in your choices, in how you stay kind without expecting anything in return. Because in the end, what earns respect isn't how loud your argument is, but how steady you remain in a world that's forgotten how to listen. And if someone ever asks you, "Why don't you argue back? Why don't you explain yourself anymore?" you can simply smile and say, "Because I've chosen to live the truth, not to convince anyone of it." And that, my friend, is true freedom. Part 15. When you stop reflecting them, they lose their direction. There are people in this world who only feel real when they see you reacting. They don't know who they are until you laugh or cry because of them. They don't have a true sense of self. They only exist as a reflection in someone else's eyes. It may sound strange, but that's how narcissists operate. They don't live from within. They survive by seeing how others feel about them. An elderly woman once shared with me, "I loved someone for nearly 2 decades, but now I realize they were never fully present. They lived through my gaze, my admiration, and when I stopped reacting, they became confused." She paused, then added, "It's like, without me there to confirm they were lovable, pitiful, or forgivable, they didn't know who they were anymore." It seems like a small story, but it reveals something profound about emotional manipulation in unbalanced relationships. The Buddha taught us to return to our true nature, to live from within, not through borrowed identities or outside validation. But narcissists are the opposite. They are empty mirrors, only seeing themselves in your reaction. So when a deeply sensitive person, someone intuitive and wholehearted, begins pulling back, stops reacting, stops trying to heal or understand the other, that's when the narcissist loses direction. Because what they fear most isn't losing you. It's losing the version of themselves that you helped create. Imagine this. An actor on stage used to applause after every scene. But one day, they perform and the theater is empty. No clapping, no response. No one left to tell them who they are. And they panic. Not because they forgot their lines, but because they no longer know what role they're playing. When you stop reflecting, they stop existing in the way they're used to. And that is the moment power shifts. Not through shouting, not through dramatic exits, but by simply no longer playing the mirror. You come home to yourself, to a life that no longer revolves around who needs what from you to maintain their illusions. As the Buddha once said, the wise one lives grounded in themselves, unshaken by the gaze of the world. And when you live that way, you don't just reclaim yourself. You force the other to face something they've always avoided, the emptiness within themselves. So after all the emotional swings, the arguments, the explanations, what a sensitive soul ultimately chooses isn't victory. It's release with clarity. Not because they're tired, but because they've finally seen clearly. Not because they've run out of words, but because those words were never truly heard. True peace doesn't come from being understood or valued by others. It comes from no longer needing them to feel whole. And when you stop reflecting them, when you step away quietly but firmly, the game ends. No argument, no validation, just a heart bright enough to stop being pulled by the outside world. And if you're on that journey of returning to your truth, of claiming peace that doesn't need approval, then I celebrate you. You're not growing weaker. You're growing wiser. And most importantly, you're returning home to yourself. If this message speaks to your heart, help us share it with someone else who might need healing too. Please subscribe to the Buddhism Seeds channel. Hit like, share this video, and leave a comment below, maybe your story, your feelings, or a gentle message to your future self. Because sometimes, a single heartfelt word from you can light up someone else's darkest day.